All right, good morning and good afternoon to some. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Water Management, What Building Owners and Operators Should Know. Presenting today, who you can see on your screen there, will be Forensic Analytical's very own Director of Scientific Operations, Megan Canright Racicot, and Senior Project Manager, Madeleine Rebullida. Megan Canright is a certified industrial hygienist and is our Director of Scientific Operations and has over 20 years of experience in the fields of industrial hygiene and environmental health and safety. Her primary area of expertise includes occupational and environmental exposure assessment, indoor environmental quality, and the evaluation and control of Legionella and other waterborne pathogens in support of infection control. Megan is also involved in litigation support and oversight for numerous complex litigation claims for both plaintiff and defense attorneys. And our other presenter, Madeleine Rebullida, is our Senior Project Manager and a certified, I'm going to try not to butcher this, ASSE IAPMO 12080 Legionella Water Safety and Management Specialist. Madeleine's currently a leader in our healthcare and water quality practice groups, where she develops and supervises waterborne pathogen management programs, water quality risk assessments, and outbreak investigations in healthcare, commercial, and education settings. And prior to working in industrial hygiene, Madeleine also worked for about 4 years in laboratory science, including microbiology, plant physiology, and wastewater analysis. But before I hand it off to Megan and Madeleine, I just want to quickly cover a few components of our webinar platform today, GoToWebinar. Everybody's in listen-only mode, but it doesn't mean you can't communicate with us. If you think of any questions throughout the presentation, there will be a Q&A portion at the very end. So if you think of any questions or have any that come up, please enter them in the question box on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar screen, and we will get those and bring those up to both presenters at the very end. So thank you. Enter those in the question box as we go throughout. And with that, I will hand it off to Megan. And let me unmute her really quick here. And Megan, I think you've got to unmute yourself, actually. Sorry about that, guys. If you stop sharing your screen for just a second, Megan, I think you'll be able to do it that way.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So Madeleine and I are going to go through, give you a little bit of a background and an introduction to water and human health. Why is water quality important, and why is there so much visibility on water quality in recent years? We're going to talk about select waterborne contaminants. Just a few we're going to be highlighting today among the many that are out there. And then Madeleine's going to cover regulation standards and guidance. Again, a select few number of those regulation standards and guidance that can help guide your water management practices. And then we're going to finish up with what exactly do we need to do? How do you navigate those risk factors and mitigation strategies for your particular facility? Okay, water and human health. So some fun facts about water. Water is a universal solvent. You may remember that from high school chemistry class. It dissolves more substances than any other liquid. In terms of our usage of water, humans on average drink about or consume about 1 to 1.3 gallons of water per day on average. But their usage in terms of total usage, and that would be from showers, from washing dishes, laundry, that sort of thing, is 85 gallons of water on average per person per day. So water is really important for human life, right? And then between 20 and 25% of global water demand is expected. There's supposed to be a 20 to 25% increase in global water demand by the year 2050. So we're only using more water over time. And as you all know, water is very critical to human health. Most of our bodies are made up of water, and we need to consume water for life. And it's essential to all life on Earth. 97% of the Earth's water is actually undrinkable. It's too salty, and 2% of Earth's water is locked in permanent ice caps and glaciers, which only leaves 1% available for human use, for human consumption use. in terms of how our watersheds are changing over time, 19% of watersheds are facing more variability and less predictable water supply as time moves on. So we're seeing less predictability and less predictable access to water sources. And 51 countries are predicted to have extreme water stress by 2050. So again, it's a limited resource, and as the population continues to grow, we expect to have less access to clean water for use. Just a brief history of waterborne illness. Prior to the 1850s, there was this miasma theory, which really prevailed as the medical explanation for an infectious disease. And what that theory really posited was that infectious particles were in the air, and those particles came from decaying organic matter, human waste, and that is really what was the only cause of infectious disease. People weren't really thinking about water as a medium or a carrier for illness. And in the 1850s, Dr. John Snow began to pose alternative theories, such as other mediums like water, as it related to the communication of cholera. And you may remember the Broad Street pump case, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. But from 1900 to 1950, most U.S. cities had installed lead water pipes. And even though, and there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of communication about lead being actually helpful for your health, even though lead poisoning hazards were really well recognized since the 1800s, but still lead pipes were widely installed in the US from 1900 to 1950. So in 1854, there was the Broad Street pump cholera outbreak. There was a surge in cholera cases in London. And actually, Dr. John Snow used epidemiology principles to try to track the cases. And he theorized that it was this pump that was the cause of these cases. And it ended up with the removal of the pump handle, which essentially stopped the outbreak. And after that was really a lot of focus on the development of sanitary sewer management to try to prevent contamination of groundwater sources with human waste to help with sanitization. And then in 1908, Dr. John Lear, to the opposition of a lot of his peers, was a huge proponent for adding chlorine into the municipal water supply. And so the chlorine was first added to Jersey City, New Jersey, the municipal water supply for disinfection. And as a result of that, in the short 10 to 12 year period after that happened, there was a significant decrease in the incident rate of typhoid, dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses. So an infection drops by 64% by 1920. So really significant chlorination and disinfection of water was a very significant public health improvement. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, and that required the Environmental Protection Agency to set drinking water standards. The EPA surface water treatment rule was established in 1989. As part of that, there was the Legionella, maximum contaminant level goals were established. For Legionella, currently, the goal is 0 organisms in municipal water. And then in 1991, the EPA established the current action level for lead of 15 parts per billion, again, with a maximum contaminant level goal, which is not enforceable, of 0 parts per billion. And then you all may remember the Flint, Michigan water crisis between 2014 and 2016. There were increased cases of legionellosis and significant lead contamination in the municipal water supply serving homes, businesses, and other buildings in the city of Flint, Michigan. It was traced back to an issue with the municipal water treatment, which led to increased corrosion in the supply pipework. And that was the cause of not only the Legionnaire's disease cases and outbreak, but also the significant lead contamination and lead exposure. And then in 2015, New York City had several distinct Legionnaire's disease outbreaks that led to emergency regulations that were passed in New York State and New York City. And those are still in place today and have been fully ratified. And then 2016, we started to see a lot of states start implementing mandatory lead testing in at least K through 12 schools, also in child care centers recently. So 13 states had mandatory lead testing programs. So the implications of drinking water treatment, and I talked about this a little bit before, but essentially we see significant public health improvement with that chlorination of water. As chlorine was more widely implemented in municipal water supplies, we saw a distinct decrease in the transmission of waterborne illness. And that is really one of the primary risks with water exposure is waterborne pathogens. You can get a lot of cases of illness. It can impact a lot of people, as we saw with the Broad Street pump outbreak. And so the control of the microbiology and pathogens in water is a very critical public health issue. So in order to control the microbiology of water, we need to add disinfectant. But there's downsides to adding disinfectant. When we add chlorine or monochloramine or other disinfectants to water, we can get disinfection byproducts, things like trihalomethanes and haloacetic acids. And studies suggest that there is a negative impact to human health with the consumption and exposure to those disinfection byproducts. Additionally, the addition of disinfectants to water can lead to corrosion. So when you have oxidizer disinfectants that are in contact with pipework, you can get the leaching of lead, copper, and other materials from that piping into the water supply. So you have to add corrosion inhibitors in order to try to prevent that. So the actual control of water chemistry as part of drinking water disinfection is very important, and it's kind of a delicate balance, trying to control microbiology, controlling the release of disinfectant byproducts, and controlling corrosion within the water supply. So this schematic is taken from a study that looked at cases of illness, multiple person outbreaks associated with potable water. And unfortunately, the data is about 10 years old. It was from cases between 2013 and 2014, but some of the most recent data that we have are recent studies that we have looking at this issue. But in terms of the causes of multiple person outbreaks, so not the cases necessarily, but looking at individual outbreaks and what the cause of those outbreaks were, Legionella by far accounts for the vast majority of those outbreaks. So 57% of outbreaks that we saw in 2013 and 2014 were due to Legionella. And so again, Legionella is a very critical issue posed to building water systems. And there's some significant financial implications for waterborne illness. Again, a study looked at the financial burden of waterborne illness, not just from drinking water, but from all waterborne sources, but they did look at drinking water as a separate thing as well. So in 2014, we had 7 million infections that were associated with water, and greater than 1 million infections were associated with drinking water. There were 600,000 ER visits, almost 120,000 hospitalizations, and 6,600 deaths associated with water, all exposure routes. And that was resulting in an estimated over $3 billion in costs, healthcare costs associated with those illnesses. For Legionella specifically, over 6,000 hospitalizations associated with exposure to drinking water, Legionella in potable water. And then for mycobacteria, over 35,000 hospitalizations, and Pseudomonas, almost 2,000 hospitalizations associated with drinking water. So again, these are very significant financial burdens associated with waterborne illness. When we look at the graph up in the top corner of the slide, you can see that for drinking water, non-tuberculous mycobacteria account for the greatest burden of cost, over 75% of the cost. And then all other organisms, which would include Legionella and Pseudomonas, are accounting for the remaining almost 25% of cost associated, not necessarily cases, but cost. And then what that study concluded was that most hospitalizations and deaths that were associated with drinking water were caused by what we call biofilm-associated pathogens. And the top three there are going to be Legionella, non-tuberculous mycobacteria, and Pseudomonas. And that resulted in $2.39 billion of healthcare costs annually. So huge burden for healthcare implications from waterborne illness. In terms of the financial implications for lead in water, estimates look at lead service line replacement, and they look at about $1,200 to over $12,000 of replacement costs per service line. This is the line that leads from the municipal supply to the building that's being served. And the NRDC estimates that replacement costs in the US will be between $40 and $56 billion in total cost to replace all lead-based service lines in the US. Harvard School of Public Health looked at healthcare costs associated with lead service lines. They estimate that about $9 billion in annual healthcare savings would be seen with the replacement of all remaining US lead service lines in the country. And then over the next 35 years, with that full replacement of lead service lines, they estimate almost $800 billion in healthcare savings. So while the cost can be upwards of $50 billion, the healthcare savings is estimated at $800 billion. So a pretty good return on investment there. NRDC also estimates that 90% of those healthcare savings would be resulting from reduced cardiovascular disease, at least from the adult side there. And then you may be familiar with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was passed a few years ago, that allows for $15 billion in lead service line replacements as kind of a down payment to help jumpstart lead service line replacement in the US. And then it additionally accounts for almost $12 billion toward drinking water state revolving loan funds, which allow or help municipalities to offset the costs of lead service line replacement. In terms of the cost of remediation, so if you or your facility experiences a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, an issue with lead contamination in your building, consulting and sampling costs can range from $5,000 to $30,000 or more just for sampling alone. So that's just taking the environmental samples. And then consulting costs, labor for experts to come in and really help to interpret and help you to remediate that issue, $25,000 to $100,000 plus. So significant cost just for this consulting and sampling to figure out what's going on with that particular issue. If you're placed on water restrictions from a Department of Public Health or other authority having jurisdiction, forced bottled water can result in thousands of dollars per day. Point of use filters, if you have to implement those, they can be up to $500 each and typically have to be changed every 30 to 90 days, sometimes up to 180 days, depends largely on water quality and how often those filters are getting clogged. And then for disinfection or some kind of treatment to address a waterborne water quality issue, you can have one-time treatment costs up to $15,000 or more. And if you need to have some kind of supplemental treatment or supplemental filtration, $50,000 to $200,000 per year, if not more. And then infrastructure changes are really hard to estimate, but they can be millions. This can be plumbing changes, changing out piping, changing out equipment and components. It can be millions of dollars of cost and over time. And these costs do not include necessarily the cost of internal staff support of your staff, your facilities folks to address the issue. If there's lost revenue or lost bookings or lost occupancy because the building is closed. And then of course the cost of mitigating any reputation for media attention or other attention to the issue. These financial settlements in terms of litigation are specifically for Legionnaire's disease, but we expect that other settlements for other water quality issues would be similar. But public settlements that are available can range from $200,000 up to $5 million per complainant, so huge settlement amounts there. And settlement awards can vary based on the severity of the illness that the complainant experienced or whether there was a death, medical expenses and those costs, whether the person experienced lost wages, pain and suffering, or permanent disability. And then of course, if there's a decedent involved, that the lost financial earning power of that person can come into play as well. There can be punitive damages for things like negligence or willful misconduct. And then, there's also the workers' compensation claims and litigation side if workers are claiming exposure to waterborne pathogens or waterborne contaminants. And then there's also this question about criminal liability. Can building owners and operators or other officials be held criminally responsible? And while we haven't necessarily seen this during the Flint, Michigan crisis, there were some officials that were criminally indicted. The charges were dropped, but it is not outside the realm of possibility. And then in terms of the regulatory side, certainly the State Department of Public Health could be involved. They can order closure if they deem the issue to be a significant public health risk. They can issue violations and fines for failure to comply. If OSHA gets involved when there's an occupational exposure, they can issue violations, and then they can issue additional fines for serious misconduct, willful misconduct, or repeat violations. And then there can be other failures to comply or fines for failing to register in compliance with any public health ordinances or regulations that may be in place on the city or state level. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Madeleine, and she's going to review some of the select waterborne contaminants.
Thank you, Megan. It was a very comprehensive review. So now that we've traumatized you with some of the financial liability and some legal liability that can happen, let's just take a look at what are the potential hazards and the different contaminants that are in your water. So with respect to building water systems, there's a number of different hazards that could be present. We can group them into 3 different categories: physical, chemical, and biological. With your physical hazards, that's going to be scalding, high temperature water, or the presence of sediment or particulate in the water. Your chemical hazards in your water can look a little different depending on the type of building and the type of water coming to it. But in general, we're looking at 2 big things: disinfection byproducts, which Megan mentioned earlier, and then corrosion byproducts that might be associated with some of those disinfectants. And then biological. So that's going to be any of your microbial pathogens like bacteria, like Legionella, fungi, and protozoa, and different things that need to be controlled for with that disinfectant in the water. So next slide. So looking at some of the exposure routes, when we talk about drinking water and hazards in drinking water, I think we tend to focus on drinking the water, but different organisms can transmit those illnesses in different ways. So the different ways you can be exposed to a water pathogen is through ingestion. Like I just said, you can drink contaminated water. So that would be like, a protozoa, like that gives you like a stomach bug, or eating food that was grown in contaminated water. If you recall, there's been several E. coli outbreaks of food that's been washed with contaminated water. That would also be a method of ingestion. Inhalation is so inhaling contaminated aerosols. So this is most commonly, we would understand this as inhaling aerosols from a cooling tower mist or a fountain or some other misting system that has been contaminated with the Legionella. That's the only way that you're going to get sick from Legionella bacteria. It has to get into your lungs. The exception to that would be aspiration. So if you ever take a drink of water and then you kind of choke and it goes down the wrong tube, that's when something that should be going down in your throat into your stomach ends up going the other direction and into your lungs. So you can aspirate those contaminated aerosols, or even aspirate some contaminated water as you're drinking it. And then dermal exposure. So dermal is just your skin. And so it's not just exposure through skin or openings and cuts on the skin, but that includes your eyes and your mucosa. So the inside of the lining of your mouth. And those are places that can absorb things very, very quickly. Next slide. So let's talk about Legionella. This one's my favorite. So Legionella is a bacteria. It causes an illness called Legionnaire's disease, which is a type of pneumonia. It does need to be diagnosed in a specific way. So they have to do some testing to diagnose it. People at the highest risk, it's kind of like with COVID, it's people who are older, are immunocompromised, or have some kind of underlying condition. It does have an incubation period of 2 to 14 days. So I mentioned that, and it's good to remember, because if public health comes to your building and tells you that they believe that there's someone who's been sick with Legionnaire's disease and they're associated with their building, basically what it means is they've been in your building within the last 2 to 14 days from when they were diagnosed. It can be fatal. The mortality rate is up to 30%. People who do survive with Legionnaire's disease often have some long-lasting side effects, which is part of why the litigation costs are so high, because you're addressing quality of life, and the litigation can be very prolonged. Other illnesses that can be caused by Legionella bacteria are Pontiac fever, and it's like a mild respiratory illness. Extrapulmonary legionnosis, which just means it's a Legionella infection that is outside of your lungs. And so that could be your heart, your pancreas, your lymphatic system, or even neurological symptoms. And then any complications from the above could be associated with Legionella. It can have long-term respiratory impacts. You can develop something called sepsis, which is like a bad infection in your blood, which can cause an amputation, and you could have long-lasting heart or neurological issues. Next slide. So we think of Legionnaire's disease, as being maybe something from the past. We know that the very famous first cases in 1976 at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel, but actually these Legionnaire's cases have been on the rise and continue to rise over the years. And so this is the most recent data that we have from CDC. It goes up to 2021, and you can see that there's a steady rise. And some of this increase in numbers might be increased reporting as we develop better technology and requirements for how we diagnose the illness. But an increase of 9 times increase is something that we definitely need to be paying attention to. Next slide.
And Madeleine, I'm sorry if I could just add. Can you hear me? Am I muted?
Yep. No, you're good.
I can just add, I'm sorry, that dip at 2020, of course, was due to COVID. We had less exposures in building water systems because of stay-at-home orders, et cetera. So that's where the dip is. So it's a little bit of a misleading dip there. We do expect that cases are continuing to rise.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And the similarities between some of the respiratory symptoms of Legionella-associated illness and those with COVID are pretty close, right? And so there could be some overlapping there as well. So risk factors with Legionella. So we expect Legionella is a bacteria. It's endemic to water and soil. And the only way it gets into your building is from the public water supply. So we expect it to be there in low levels. And when it's well controlled, it's not an issue. It's when there are conditions present that allow it to grow or amplify. And there's 4 main categories of those conditions: at temperature, so favorable temperature in the growth range, so 68 degrees to 120 degrees. And then there's this like ideal perfect range from 77 to 113. And you think about if it's a human pathogen, it wants to grow at a temperature that's like the temperature inside of your body, right? In areas where there's low flow or stagnation, so if you have a closed building, reduced occupancy or dead legs, so like a length of pipe that kind of goes nowhere, that can be an area where you can have proliferation of Legionella. And then the other 2 are if there's no disinfectant or very low disinfectant. And that dip in disinfectant, some of it could be, there's a lot of variability in what you get from the city water supply, depending on the type of disinfectant. But when the water sits stagnant, those disinfectants tend to dissipate out of solution. And so those numbers will get lower. Or when you heat water to really high temperatures, that will also break down the disinfectant in the water. And then corrosion and scale. So if you have some stagnant conditions, there's a lot of contact from the water and the chemicals in the water with your pipework, that can cause corrosion and scale buildup. And then you can also have biofilms form that biofilms are basically like a little city of different organisms, and they can be visible to the eye. They can be not visible to us. If you've ever taken off, the end of your faucet and you see there's like slime in there, that's what a biofilm is. And it's this protected layer where bacteria and other organisms can grow and duplicate, amplify. And then when those biofilms are disturbed, you have free-living, free-floating organisms that are now then moving through your pipework. But if you have a well-established biofilm, say in one of those dead legs, it can be very difficult to eradicate those biofilms. So some of the, we talked about exposure pathways as well. So you think about different kind of components. If you don't mind going back 1 slide, Megan, different like components in your building where you might have exposures. We mentioned cooling towers, but showers, if there's construction like a water main break, disruption to service to the building, that can cause issues. Hot tubs and decorative fountains are all potential exposure sources. Next slide. So we kind of talked about this a little bit. I like to put these really gross pictures in there. And actually, it's a little misleading because that pipe on the bottom left, I believe, is a sewer standpipe. But we can see what builds up in there. That green stuff is some corrosion and scale. And definitely on the outside of that shower head, you can see all that stuff. So where you have that scale and corrosion, scale is like a buildup of minerals that were in the water. that can be a nutrient source for bacteria. And so then you turn that on, you aerosolize the water, and then that's how you get exposed. You can inhale it into your lungs. Next slide. So Megan mentioned these, and so we'll just briefly talk about it. I don't need to read everything that's on the slide, but there's two other water pathogens that you should be aware of. And one is Mycobacterium, or NTM, non-tuberculosis mycobacterium, or you just remember it as NTM. This is something that we commonly find in municipal water and in your premise plumbing. Impacts the same subset of people as Legionella does, so people who are immunocompromised or higher risk. Same type of exposure route through the aerosols, but also with direct contact. So if you have a cut or opening in your skin, or you get it in your eyes, you can get infected that way. And similar types of illnesses, but you could also have like soft tissue infections. So you could develop a wound that is very difficult to take care of, or it can also be present on implanted medical devices. So if it was in the water and then you had the surgical procedure, and it could grow on those devices as well. And sometimes the symptoms the infection has no symptoms, but when they do, it can be pretty severe. Very common sources for this is going to be not just your water in your building, but pools and spas, heaters, coolers, things like that. Next slide. Pseudomonas, kind of similar to NTM. It is opportunistic. You may see it as Pseudomonas aeruginosa, but Pseudomonas is more commonly heard. Exposure routes are pretty similar, except this one also would include person-to-person contact. And so this is sometimes how people get infections in hospitals, as there can be Pseudomonas on the hands of the caregiver, and that gets transmitted to the patient while they're doing some kind of procedure or giving them some type of care. It's very common to have it on your skin. It's normal to have Pseudomonas colonizing your skin, or in your throat, or even in the feces of healthy people. So the different types of illnesses, similar types of things, but pneumonias, you can get bad eye infections, wound infections, ear infections, and that sepsis that I mentioned earlier with the blood poisoning. Common sources, same type of stuff, pools and spas, also on respiratory equipment. So if you have your CPAP at home or your sleep apnea machine, and you're not really diligently cleaning out that reservoir of water, that could also get colonized. Next slide. All right, let's get away from the scary organisms and go to some metals and water, lead and copper and water. So Megan's talked a lot about lead and water, and some of these lead service lines. There's still about just over 9 million lead service lines that are still in place. And the way that lead and copper enter the drinking water is from the corrosion of the plumbing materials that have lead in them, which could be, flux, it could be different types of gaskets and things within different components within backflow preventers and valves and things like that. The picture that you see there, that's an actual picture that I took several days ago, and that green color, that's typically you're going to see that with copper or even manganese, and that it looks green there. The water was like blue-green, and so that's an indicator that there's certainly some corrosion going on in those lines. And so in 1986, the EPA banned lead components in new construction. That does not mean that there is no lead in any new construction. So all the way up until 2014, if it was lead-free, that just meant that it could contain up to 8% lead. So it was not completely lead-free. Currently, since 2020, lead-free means 0.25% for fixtures and fittings and 0.2% for solder and flux. So that number's gone down quite a bit. Next slide. NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, found that just over half, almost 60% of the US population has drank water from systems with detectable lead fairly recently. So from 2018 to 2020 is when they did this study. 20% of lead exposures are due to exposure to water, but sadly 40 to 60% of those are in formula-fed infants. And so that has to do with you're mixing the water with the formula and feeding it to the infant. Buildings that were built before 1986 are more likely to have lead-containing components, but it doesn't mean that if your building is built after 1986, it won't have any lead-containing components. Next slide. Lead in school water. So we pay a lot of attention to this because lead can really adversely impact young children. It causes some long-term neurological effects. So there was a study in 2017 that was done that almost half of the school districts that were serving 12 million students had not tested for any lead in the last 12 months. 43% of those districts serving up to 35 million students had tested for lead. And of those, 37% found elevated levels of lead. And so you can see there's a map down there from PIRG, the Public Interest Resource Group, and it grades each state on where they're at in getting lead out of the water. And so where you see it red, that's an F, green is a B, and blue is a C. So you can see we still have a long way to go throughout most of the country to address these issues. Next slide. Lead exposure, as I said, it can have neurological effects. It impacts almost every single system in your body. Lead is a metal, and it can be very difficult to get out of the body. And it can be in your blood. It can be in your reproductive system. It can stay there for a long time. The neurological effects that I had mentioned, that it can cause memory loss. It can cause difficulty in learning, comprehension. It can also cause mood swings, headaches, irritability, and the effects can stay in your body for a very long time, throughout the course of your life even. Children who've been exposed to lead are more likely to have a lower IQ and have hearing loss, as well as those learning disabilities and behavior problems. Next slide. So where can we find lead in your home? So there's all different sources. We talked about fixtures, fittings, solder. Fixtures are where we most commonly are finding it in your faucets that may have lead containing components. You could have a lead service line. You could have copper pipe that has lead solder in it. You could have some galvanized pipe work, or any kind of like loose goosenecks that are the connection points to the main water line. Those can have lead in them as well. And there's a smaller picture up there where you can see just, it kind of describes all the pieces here, but all of those different components of that line could potentially have lead in them. And you can see the notation there. There's a plumbing product that's engraved with a certification mark, and that's how you should know that if it's lead free, or 0.25 or 0.2%. Next slide. Okay, so this is a lot, and you should have access to these slides afterwards. But when it comes to the lead exposure limits, there's no real consensus on this. Important for you to understand as a building owner is, if you are going to test your water for lead, you need to decide which threshold you're going to hold yourself to, and how you're going to interpret those. So there's three different essentially limits that EPA has established. The EPA does not have a maximum contaminant level for lead. They say it's not feasible to have 0 lead in your water. There is an action limit of 15 parts per billion, and that's what you're going to most commonly see. But these are not health-based limits, which is very important to understand. The maximum contaminant level goal is 0 parts per billion. But again, these are not health-based. We know that there is no safe level of lead, just as there is no safe level of asbestos, right? There's OEHA has a public health goal of 0.2 parts per billion. California Prop 65 also has 0.2 parts per billion. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics has 1 part per billion. And then I believe also Megan Bottled Water, FDA, has 5 parts per billion as their limit that can be in the water. So again, just understanding that there's a lot of nuance to how you're going to do this. And that 15 parts per billion is probably easy to achieve, but again, not health-based. Next slide. Disinfection byproducts. So these are generated when disinfectants are added to the water. And so there's 2 big disinfectants that you're going to get in your public water supply, either chlorine or monochloramine, which is essentially just ammonia and chlorine together, right? And when they're added to the water, they can react with some of the organic materials that are present in the water, and then that will cause the release of these, or the creation of these disinfection byproducts. These have been associated in some studies with increased cancer risk and issues with your nervous system, your liver, and kidney. These are trihalomethanes. You'll see them abbreviated as THM, or haloacetic acids, HAA5, bromate, and chlorite are also products of disinfectants. Chlorine dioxide can be another disinfectant that's added to your water. It's typically added as supplementary disinfection. Then there's these other disinfection byproducts that are not regulated. There's a number of them there. They're still being studied, but some have shown increased cancer risk. Next slide. All right, regulation, standards, and guidance. Next. All right, there's a lot of different regulation, standards, and guidance. So important to understand a regulation, this is like a law, you have to follow it, you're required to do it. Standards and guidance are voluntary. So there are voluntary standards that regulatory agencies have referenced and adopted. So even though it's a standard, it kind of becomes a regulation. And so there's a little bit of a confusing overlap. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much on these, but just to give you a sense of what the big ones are. Next slide. So EPA, the EPA is a federal regulatory agency, and they have federal regulations and mandates that public water suppliers need to follow. So that's going to be your Safe Drinking Water Act, Lead and Copper Rule, FERPA, which is insecticide, fungicide, rodenticide, EPA Stage 1 and Stage 2 disinfections and disinfection byproducts, those are that trihalomethanes we talked about. In healthcare, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services requires hospitals to have a program to manage water for Legionella and other water pathogens, as well as the VA has a similar directive that has to be followed for VA hospitals. GSA, the General Services Administration, they put out a directive recently to do testing in all of their buildings for different contaminants in water. So these are required things depending on the type of building you are, right? Next slide. So there's also state and local regulations, and I would encourage always double check with your state. So in Legionella, for Legionella, there is no, outside of healthcare, there are no regulations for Legionella, with the exception of a few states. Some healthcare facilities are required to sample for Legionella as well. In California, New York State, New Jersey, there are specific rules around cooling towers and how cooling towers are to be treated, maintained. They have to do with sampling and potentially reporting sampling results to the state agencies. In schools, very important, there are lead testing regulations in schools in a number of states, including California, and supplemental disinfection. So supplemental disinfection is if you have a treatment system inside your building that's adding an additional disinfectant to your water, and that sometimes requires permitting depending on the state. Next. And then these are the voluntary standards, and there's a number of them. We can go to the next slide as well. So predominantly ASHRAE 514, 541, IAPMO, that's the plumbing organization, American Industrial Hygiene Association, the CDC, which though it's a federal agency, they are not a regulatory agency. They establish guidance. And then the EPA does have some guidance for how to do lead testing in schools. And these are all things that you need to take into consideration as if you're looking at sampling in your water or managing your water system. Next.
All right, so and those documents are all available. Some are available free of charge. You can download them, on the internet, and then some require purchase. But there's essentially the guidance that we have available is exhaustive. The voluntary standards and guidance specifically requires building owners and operators to do a lot. So the resources, staffing, and the cost associated with implementing all of the recommendations in those voluntary standards and guidelines is, again, it's huge. So it can be a real challenge for building owners and operators to manage and implement every single recommended control measure. So really what it comes down to is risk assessment and prioritization. What are the areas? And every building water system is different. So risk assessment for the particular building is critical so that you as the building owner and operator can understand what are your highest risks, and you can put your resources and costs towards addressing those highest risks. So what's a risk assessment? Well, the first step is understanding and describing your water system. You need to, and your team needs to understand how water is distributed through your building, both potable water and non-potable water sources. So drinking water and non-drinking water sources. The best way to do that, in our opinion, is through a very thorough building walkthrough, starting at where the water comes into the building, how it's tempered and processed, and then how it's distributed to various fixtures throughout the building. Review of plumbing plans can be really critical in helping you understand. You can't see all the piping, behind the walls. So having plumbing plans, which may or may not be accurate, but can really help you to get an idea of how water is distributed. And then using that understanding of the building water system to identify hazards. Where might you have Legionella risk factors and other waterborne pathogen risk factors? Where might you have lead hazards? Where might you see disinfection byproducts or other water contaminants? And then certainly identifying any at-risk populations. If you're a healthcare facility or skilled nursing facility, you may have immunocompromised or elderly people present. If you're operating a school, obviously children are going to be present. So you do need to think not only about the building itself and the water system, but the occupants in the building as well. And then once you've identified all of those hazards, you can line them all up and rank them based on your risk assessment findings. And there's really not one way to prioritize risk. This is just an example using probability and severity. So how probable is the exposure to occur? So where is someone going to be exposed to the waterborne contaminant? Is it showers? Is it drinking water? Is it the bubblers at the school? And then how severe is the possible outcome? How many people would it impact? Would it be impacting susceptible people? Would it be impacting a larger population? So this is just one way to help you prioritize risk. And you can use matrices like this to really identify, is it a low? And this is somewhat subjective, right? But you're using a ranking system to subjectively, with a little bit of objective input, trying to identify as something low risk, medium risk, high risk, or very high. And by doing that, as long as you have a documented process for how you're prioritizing your risk, then you can justify putting your resources towards addressing those highest risks first. You want to place those resources at the areas that can result in the most exposure or the most severe outcomes. And so this is just one way that your water team can help you to prioritize the many risks that may be in your facility. And then develop a water management plan. So as part of that risk assessment process, that's really going to inform your hazard identification, and then again, prioritizing those risks and identifying what control measures you're implementing to control those risks. Is it flushing? Is it managing temperature and disinfectant level? Is it doing preventive maintenance? So the process for developing a water management plan, and we could do a whole webinar just based on water management plans, but is really to form a team of people that understand your building and your processes, and have those people place their input into the development of the water management plan. Generate some diagrams and the relevant building history so that you can get that, understanding of the system, identify the hazards, and then develop controls for the hazards that you identify as part of the assessment process. And then you're going to want to monitor those control measures. How often are you flushing? Is the flushing being done? What are the temperatures? You're taking temperature and disinfectant measurements throughout your facility. And is it being done right? Is what we're doing, is what we say we're doing, are we doing it? Is that we're verifying that we're doing it? And is it working? We're validating with some kind of sampling that it's being done. And then, of course, documentation, making sure that you have the documentation and the right records is going to be really critical in terms of ongoing water management plan implementation. So these are just some focused mitigation strategies that we really see buildings focus on. Flushing and managing stagnation. A lot of water quality issues can occur with stagnant water. So flushing low-use fixtures and components to get water moving through the building. This can help with waterborne pathogens, disinfection byproducts, and contaminants like lead and copper. Temperature control, keeping your water hot, your hot water hot and your cold water cold. That can help to manage the water chemistry and also keep microbiological growth at bay or pathogen growth at bay. And then disinfectant control. And this one can be tricky unless you have supplemental disinfection because you're relying on the municipality to give you disinfectant, but keeping disinfectant residual greater than 0.5 part per million. So if that's free chlorine or monochloramine, and less than the maximum, which is 4 part per million. Doing cleaning and disinfection, removing scale, biofilm, and debris. This can involve, properly cleaning cooling towers, properly cleaning and disinfecting cooling towers, managing water heaters, flushing debris out of water heaters, making sure they're cleaned and disinfected regularly, shower heads, replacing or cleaning shower heads and aerators, and then of course, ice machines, making sure that all the components undergo cleaning and disinfection regularly. In terms of filtration, you can implement filters, but they're really just it's kind of like using a respirator to prevent exposure. It's not controlling the cause, it's controlling the exposure. So, but you can implement filtration in high-risk patient areas like in healthcare, or with dedicated bottle filling stations like in schools or office buildings to prevent lead exposure. And then preventive maintenance. So doing repair, keeping your equipment in working order, replacing aging equipment, and replacing lead containing components like service lines and other fixtures. And then just a quick note about sampling, because sampling is really critical to validate that your program is working. So sampling for lead, copper, what specific waterborne pathogens, you're gonna implement a water sampling program as part of your water management program validation. But just a quick note about sampling. We don't recommend doing proactive sampling when you don't have a water management plan in place. If you're not doing any water management practices, you can go and sample and you may find lead, Legionella, and you're not prepared to do anything about it. So the best way to implement sampling is to have a water management plan placed in first and use that sampling to validate that your control measures are working. You can also use sampling to support an outbreak investigation if there's cases of illness. You can, again, validate control measures to help manage risk. That we call that routine sampling. You can evaluate the success of remediation. Let's say you did a building disinfection or you removed lead fixtures from your building. You can sample to validate that those measures were effective. And then you can also do sampling as part of construction prior to connecting water service to the building for use, and then also prior to turnover for permitted occupancy. There can be a lag between when you do the construction testing and when you actually turn the building over for occupancy. So using sampling to help ensure that water quality is acceptable before occupants will be exposed. And then before you collect any sample, any one single sample, make sure you have a sampling plan, understand why you're taking samples, where they're being collected, and understand how those samples are going to be interpreted. So what do the locations mean? Why are you taking a sample from that location? What guidance are you going to use to interpret that sample? Like coming back to those lead exposure limits and guidelines, which ones are you going to use? And then, of course, be prepared to implement corrective action. If you find Legionella, if you find lead, you're going to have to do something about it. So have your ducks in a row and your plan aligned before you take those samples to take action when you need to. And I think with that, we've got a few minutes for questions, if there are any.
Megan, I will add just one last thing that I wanted to mention in the regulations and standards is that you saw that big long list, right? There's a lot of them, and those get updated periodically. More recently, there's been some newer standards come out that sort of speak to this sort of very heightened awareness of water quality. I think a lot of it has to do with what happened in Flint, and then also buildings that were closed for so long during COVID. So CDC has some additional guidance for reopening buildings. More recently, there was a standard ST 108, which deals with water quality for sterile processing instruments, which actually there was no standard for that before. And there's also been a couple publications that are actually free, one from IAPMO, which is the plumbing organization, and it's best practices for water and construction. So if you know you're going to have some construction coming up at your site, I highly recommend looking this up and downloading it. It's free. But just knowing that this is something we need to pay more and more attention to, because it's kind of at the forefront of not just public awareness, but regulatory awareness.
And just to add to, I think it's unfortunately we can't tell you what's the one thing that you can do. It's not like one control measure will control everything in your water quality. It's often incremental changes over time. You're implementing control measures, over time to help control the general water quality, and that's all going to depend on that risk assessment and the specific risk factors that your building may or may not have.
Thank you both. We've had a few questions come in, so I just want to make sure we've got a few minutes for these. The first one being, can sampling be performed by local facilities / EHS staff, or is there certification required to collect those samples?
Good question. Megan, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, there's in terms of collecting samples in a building, there can be some certification requirements for municipalities in terms of their training for taking like municipal water samples. But in terms of inside your building, there's no mandated certification requirement that I'm aware of. It is important, however, to get the right training before you go and collect samples. So having the right background training there are some voluntary certifications like ASSC 12080, that's a Legionella management professional certification, and that can help to provide samplers with the background knowledge so that they can properly collect and interpret samples. And then those guidance documents, the 3Ts document, that's a great resource for obtaining the right information to collect samples correctly. But the long and the short of it is, I wouldn't recommend having an untrained person go out and collect samples. There are a lot of resources available to adequately and properly train staff to collect samples. And so that training is available.
Alrighty, thank you. The next question, do water testing requirements apply to colleges? Sounds like this person works for a college and they currently only perform at their childcare facilities. Is it required elsewhere as well?
Short answer, no. I'm assuming with the childcare facilities, you're talking about lead. That's required. In your building, no, there's no requirement. There was some legislation that was published in California recently. It didn't end up going through, which was to require testing for lead, Legionella, and other things in all public buildings. But again, that was not approved. But I would not be surprised if there was something in the future, that, especially in California.
And why is that? It's because the concept is that children are disproportionately affected by exposure to lead. Their bodies are developing, their nervous system is developing, the brain, and so the focus, the legislative and regulatory focus has been on assessing K through 12 or childcare centers first, because those are the ages typically they're at most risk. But that doesn't mean that children over 18 or adults over the age of 18 are not impacted. And so it's unfortunate that there hasn't been focus there. But as Madeleine said, there could be definitely, we suspect that something will come in the future, whether it's next year or 10 years or 20 years from now, we don't know, but certainly it will be a focus.
Great. Next question. If our facility receives disinfectant from the city already, how can we control it inside the building? Can't we just ignore disinfectant and focus on temperature and flushing instead?
Madeleine,
That one's to you, Megan. No, I'm punting it to you.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so you do get a level. So municipalities that serve a certain number of people are required to monitor, to treat and monitor their water. But they're only required to give you, in most cases, a detectable concentration at the point of entry to the building. After the point of entry to the building, which is your water meter, your backflow preventer, it's now the onus is on the building owner and operator to manage it. So there are no guarantees after that point of entry to the building. Flushing can be helpful too. So relying on the city disinfectant alone is not sufficient. You can do flushing to help move that disinfectant through the water. That is effective in cold water systems, because disinfectant can, and depending on whether you have chlorine or monochloramine, chlorine can dissipate rather quickly, whereas monochloramine is kind of slower acting and can have a longer lasting residual. But you can try to flush to move that disinfectant through the building. The challenge is in hot water, where you're moving that cold water that has disinfectant in it through a heating, a water heater or a heat exchanger, where that heat is breaking down the disinfectant. So while flushing can help to get disinfectant to where it needs to go, it may or may not last or survive the heating and tempering process in your building. So relying just on city disinfectant alone, I mean, we see cases of Legionnaire's disease all the time in buildings that have city disinfectant and enough city disinfectant at the point of entry. It's just dissipates within the building and creates a risk.
Great. And we've got time for one more question here. Do you work with homeowners often? Would you recommend they take the same steps as any facility? Conduct risk assessments, remove high-risk fixtures or lines, and sampling to verify? Or do you have any other specific recommendations?
So the EPA has a lot of information on lead for homeowners. There's a wealth of information. There's a guidance document. There's a whole EPA page that is dedicated to lead in your home and how you can address lead in your home. It's the same simple control measures, replacing lead service lines if you have one. It's making sure that your fixtures have lead-free components. If you have galvanized pipe, if you own a very old home, you could have galvanized pipe in your home. So the only real solution there is replacing the piping to get rid of that galvanized pipe. But it's the same control measures. Flushing, it's using cold water for cooking because hot water can have higher dissolved lead in it because hot water can dissolve lead more easily than cold water. It's flushing the fixture before you use it. So yes, we sometimes work with homeowners. The way the EPA looks at that is it's a smaller scale, right? You're not dealing with a really complicated water system typically. So maybe those control measures are implemented on a smaller scale. So if you go to the EPA website and look at, lead in your home, there'll be a lot of helpful resources for specifically dealing with issues in residential situations.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, Madeleine. And thank you, everybody, for attending. We're out of time today. But just as a reminder, we recorded today's session, so we will be sending out a link to that tomorrow once the video is done processing and uploading. We will also send out Madeleine and Megan's contact information that you see there as well in case you have any follow-up questions. But thank you guys again. Great presentation. Thanks, everybody, for attending. And you'll see an email come from us tomorrow. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.